Hey everyone, I'm Mike Settele, and this is my final SAT predictions video ever. I recently made my final reading predictions video. This one is for the math modules. But remember, the good news here is that it's going to work for every single SAT test date. It does not matter whether you are taking the SAT in March or May or August or October. These predictions will be good. They will also be good for the next couple of years as the SAT continues to be in this version of the test, the digital SAT version released in 2024. As long as that version of the SAT is around, I will stand by these predictions. So how is it possible that I can make predictions confidently many years in advance of when you're actually going to take the test? Well, we're going to use an analogy throughout this video to kind of make this point. The SAT is kind of like a card game, like poker, okay? And the specific SAT that you take is kind of like the poker hand that you get dealt. So let's just say it's a 5-card poker hand. That is the SAT that you are taking. Now, I cannot predict exactly which questions are going to show up on your test. So if each card is a question, I don't know exactly what cards you're going to get dealt, okay? But what I do know is what is in the deck. I know based on the practice test, I know based on the question bank, I know based on my own experience what could show up, what cards you might get dealt in your hand. And so you want to be prepared no matter what cards you get dealt. So if you want a top score, it's not so much about knowing what cards are in your hand or what cards are going to show up on your test. It's about knowing everything that's in the deck so that you are prepared no matter what. Because if you're only taking practice tests as your practice, then you might not see every single thing that could be in that deck. And my hope here in this video is to give you a better sense of what could show up. And then throughout my channel, you will always find lessons on all the topics that are on the SAT. And this is especially important in math, where it's not always easy to know which cards we even got dealt on our SAT. We might be looking at a question and have no idea what it's about. It's hard to sometimes identify the topic. But if we know what's in the deck, what could be on the test, then we're gonna have a much easier time of identifying the topic when the questions really get hard. So let's start by looking at a few ways to think about your hand for your particular SAT math test date. So you probably already know that each math module on the SAT is 22 questions. So you can think of that like a 22 card hand, okay? Each question is one card. But unlike a deck of cards, which has 4 suits, right? Spades, clubs, hearts, and diamonds, I think of the SAT deck as consisting of 5 different suits, 5 different groups, and at least according to my own classification, which I admit is a bit different from the College Board's. But basically, we can think of one module as having a hand that's going to deal us 5 algebra questions, 10 XY plane questions, 3 numeracy questions, 3 geometry questions, and 1 statistics question. So again, the College Board classifies these things differently, and I will talk more about what each category means in my terms as we go through this predictions video. And this is also just a rough prediction because it's not exact. It's not held to these exact standards for every single module, but this is a rough estimate of what you can expect in your hand. But even still, this is probably what a first module is going to look like. The other module, the second module, depending on where you get placed, might have a slightly different proportion. So for example, the hard module is going to have fewer of those kind of pure algebra questions and have much more emphasis on those XY plane questions. You might also get an extra statistics question in there. As for the easy module, if you get placed there, you are more likely to see a couple extra numeracy questions. Again, I'll talk more about what that is later, but for now, just kind of think of it as like basic arithmetic. So they're probably going to be easier questions, but you can see that the overall shape of these hands is basically the same. The proportions don't change that much depending on which module you're in. So if we go back to thinking just about the first module, I also have to say that my prediction is it's not going to look exactly like this as you are taking your test. Unlike the reading sections where the question types are in a very specific order and the question types are very different from each other, right? A vocabulary question is very different from a grammar question. They use different strategies, different rules, completely different style of question. For the math modules, it's going to be tough because everything's going to blend together. All the topics are going to be all over the place. A typical module is going to require us to jump around from topic to topic quite a bit. And so one very important skill for the math modules is how can we figure out what we're dealing with for each individual question, and how can we switch between topics as we move through the sections. I'll also say that the categories that I have tend to blend together quite a bit. For example, most geometry questions will involve algebra in some way. So it's not like everything is very isolated. But for the rest of this video, what I'm going to do is go group by group through those 5 different suits and give you some more specific predictions about each one. As I do that, we will talk about it as if it's the full test, so 2 modules combined, and I will be able to kind of tell you a little bit about the kinds of topics that you will see, the kinds of things that are in the deck for each of those types of questions. Let's start with statistics, because it's such an easy place to begin. There are really just going to be 3 statistics cards that you're going to see on your entire SAT. Just 3 questions will involve statistics in some way. And so it's not really that big of a deal, but it's also a great place to talk about the difference between the hand that you get dealt and the deck of cards that those cards are being dealt from. So I can make one pretty confident prediction right out of the gate here. I do predict that at least one question that you will get dealt in your hand will involve basic statistics terms like mean, median, mode, and range. So for most people, that one question isn't that big of a deal, especially if you're not scoring super high. This might not be a big priority. But if you don't know the difference between mean and median, you are basically sacrificing 10 or 20 points per SAT. So this is a fairly important topic that you do need to know. It might even be the case that those terms show up on all 3 of these statistics questions. Again, I don't know exactly what you're going to be dealt, but there's enough of those ideas in this deck that I'm very confident you will see at least one thing that mentions one of those terms. But then what about those other 2 questions? What's going to go on there? Well, that's a lot harder to predict. I do predict that the statistics deck of cards that you could get a question from is going to include things like probability, standard deviation, box plots, margin of error, and maybe surveys, whether or not you can trust a survey or not. That's a topic that used to be on the old SAT quite a bit, but it hasn't really shown up on this digital version, but it's still in the question bank. So I don't know, it might be worth studying. So you really can't ignore any of these topics if you want to have a top score. My genuine prediction is that you won't get a question in your hand about box plots. In fact, if you've taken a bunch of practice tests, maybe even 5 practice tests, you still might not have gotten dealt a box plots question in your hand. But then I don't want to hear it when you go to the SAT and you get a box plots question and you're like, oh my God, this SAT had questions I'd never seen before. It's in the deck. I'm telling you, it's in the deck. You need to be prepared. And this is really just fundamental to how you prepare for the SAT. A lot of you think about just taking a bunch of practice tests. But think about it like this. If you're playing poker, you could play 5 hands of poker and you'll get 5 different hands, 5 different sets of cards. Does that guarantee that you're going to see every single card that's in the deck? No, it does not. So you need to prepare in a way that is thinking about the deck of the cards, not just specific hands that you get dealt every time you take a practice test. So it's really important that you think about things that way. I have playlists on my channel that really dive into each of these topics so that you can study for box plots questions even if you've never seen one yourself. So it's very important to think about the deck in that way. The good news is, even though there's more stuff in the deck that will ever show up on your test, there are more topics in this deck than will ever show up on any individual test. The deck is still limited. They're not going to ask every single statistics topic under the sun, so we can use that limited nature of the deck to help us prep in a way that's still very controlled. Now, geometry is a clear example where the limited deck is going to help you. It's not a big category overall. Just about 6 questions per SAT are what I would consider geometry questions. So if you're scoring like 650 or lower on your practice test or actual SAT, then my prediction is that geometry is not your issue, even if that's what shows up on the score report. As you saw before, algebra, XY plane, those questions are a much bigger portion of the test. So it's very unlikely that their score is going to swing that much by mastering the geometry questions. And that's especially important since it is hard to master them. There is a lot of variety even in these 6 questions. But one thing that is kind of predictable is, luckily for us, I predict that half of the geometry questions you will see will involve formulas that are given to you in the reference sheet that is there for every single math question on your SAT, right? So you get a bunch of formulas. That's really good for us. It doesn't mean that these questions are easy. They might involve just one step that involves those formulas, but at least we don't have to memorize it. It is given to us. But yes, some of these questions might just ask you for the volume of a cone, and they'll give you the radius and the height. And all you got to do is get the formula from the reference sheet, plug it in, and solve and simplify. So some of them will be that easy. And this just goes to show that the SAT is not just testing memorization with geometry, right? If they were, they wouldn't give you the formulas. They're giving them to you because there are other skills that are involved. But you will need to memorize something. So I do predict that there will be some questions in geometry specifically that you must memorize certain topics. Trigonometry is the one I feel most confident kind of throwing into your hand. It is very likely you are going to get one trigonometry question on your SAT, maybe two, maybe zero, but one is pretty much what it looks like across all of the practice tests. But there are other topics as well that you might not see on your tests, but do need to have some sort of element of memorization. Things like perimeter, surface area, some of the angle rules are very likely to come up. So there will be things that you need to memorize. At least for something like trigonometry, I can again confidently tell you what's in the deck. Most trigonometry is really just SOHCAHTOA and just knowing those simple ideas. You're not gonna have to deal with law of cosines, law of sines. None of that is on the test. It's not in the deck, so you don't have to worry about it. So thinking about geometry in that way is really good. Again, even though there are topics that require memorization, they're limited in what they ask. And so we can use that to our advantage when we get to hard geometry questions. And this is where I wanna kind of change this analogy of the cards a little bit. This whole time I've kind of been talking about one card represents one question. But the real way it works, and maybe I need to make another video on this at some point, is that it's more like each question could have multiple cards, okay? So for example, an easy geometry question might just have one topic involved, one card, right? So if you know SOHCAHTOA, you're gonna get the trigonometry question, if it's an easy one. If it's a medium difficulty one, maybe it involves two different topics, two different cards, so the cards aren't necessarily individual questions. Your hand is now kind of like a question composed of different topics. And so a medium question might have two different topics that you in some way need to combine. And that's when we get to some of those hard questions where if we're lucky, it's back to a 5-card hand, 5 different topics that are all intertwined. Some of them might not even be geometry topics. So that's what makes it hard sometimes, is knowing exactly what we get on a particular question. We might know all the geometry rules and formulas and everything like that, but being able to identify specific things in the moment for one particular question is very difficult. But again, we are going to have the advantage that we are drawing these cards, even for the hardest questions, from a very limited deck. So if you learn what's in the geometry deck, you at least know that on the hard questions, there's only so many things that they could involve. And so this is where, again, my channel is really great. I have playlists on geometry that'll help you identify each individual card, each individual topic that you could see both on an individual question or combined into one very difficult question. Moving on to the numeracy topic, which is a little weird. I will start by saying that this kind of aligns a little bit with the College Board's problem solving and data analysis category. So it gets kind of merged with statistics, but I really just don't like that category. I think it's very hard to understand. But for me, numeracy is going to be easier to understand with examples. So let me make some predictions right off the bat. I do predict that your hand of cards, the hand of questions you're dealt on your particular SAT, will involve probably roughly 2 percentage questions and one that is about unit conversion. And that kind of gives us a rough sense about what numeracy really is. It's not guaranteed that you'll get exactly these numbers of questions, but overall, the numeracy section is going to be about your ability to understand numbers and their properties. So percents are about percentages and decimals. Unit conversion is often about fractions, at least the way the College Board teaches it. I tend to avoid fractions when I teach it, but you can watch my lesson on that for more information. Those 2 questions that I didn't highlight might be about things like turning words into equations. So knowing the definitions of words like product and sum, maybe knowing the language about inequalities and how positive numbers and negative numbers are going to behave. So it's really about those building blocks of math. A lot of it is just basic arithmetic. And so for many of you, these are going to seem like very easy questions. But I predict that if you get a lower math score than you expected on your actual SAT, it's probably because of numeracy questions that you got wrong that you did not see coming. This is just from my experience over years and years and years, particularly things like percentages. People are way too overconfident in their intuition about how numbers are going to behave. You think you know what you're doing, but you're just thinking about how numbers behave instead of trying to prove it. So these are lots of cases where our process is going to be really important so that we don't fall into traps. You may not believe this prediction, but I stand by it. This is one of the most confident predictions I'm going to make, is that if you are losing points that you don't see coming on your SAT, check those numeracy questions, check percents, check your unit conversion, check some other things that involve kind of the basic properties of numbers. Your intuition about those things might be very, very wrong. So it's always important to have strategies that allow you to prove your instincts because the SAT knows how to mess with them. Moving on to algebra, I predict that you're roughly going to get 7 pure algebra questions on the SAT. And to be clear, my algebra category is different from the College Board's algebra category. And I do want to say something I said earlier, that basically algebra is everywhere on the SAT. There's no avoiding it. So these are kind of the pure algebra questions, the ones that are kind of like in the same way that numeracy questions are about how numbers behave. These questions are specifically about how variables behave. So let me give you some more solid predictions, and I think that'll help you understand. I can pretty confidently classify what you're going to see in the 7 questions you're going to get that I would classify as pure algebra. You're going to get some stuff involving the rules about foiling and factoring. You're going to get something maybe about the exponential rules, about how exponents behave. Similar to that is how radicals behave. Absolute value might show up every once in a while on your test. And then some questions will just be pure and simple, like solve this equation, simplify these variables. And so you will use these same skills all over the test. That is a confident prediction, is that these 7 questions are not the only place where you will be using this knowledge and these skills. The XY plane questions, which we'll talk about in a second, are a big source of these same pieces of information, these same concepts. But I also predict that you will lose points on your SAT if you don't use strategies to avoid algebra. Yes, they are testing it, but algebra is inherently risky because it involves both numbers and variables, and sometimes it behaves in ways that we don't expect. So we want to try to avoid it. Desmos is a great example of that. This is why you should watch my strategy series on how Desmos works, because most people don't realize that Desmos, the graphing calculator built into the SAT, can solve algebra equations for you if you know how to use it. And so a lot of times the biggest problem people have with these questions is their habits are just so strong. They will do needless algebra, solving things the old-fashioned way, because it's just the habit. It's just the way that they were taught in school, the way that they've solved those questions hundreds, if not thousands of times before. So you need to learn how to make a conscious effort to avoid some of those moves. You still need to know them, but if you can avoid them and save some time and reduce the chance of a careless mistake, it's definitely worth taking it. So this is why you need to use my channel to review questions, especially from the practice test, because the College Board will always try to explain algebra questions and other questions in the very traditional textbook way. They won't tell you when you can just plug something into Desmos. So you need to have that strategy ready to go. Again, my videos will always tell you when that's going to be the best way to solve a question. And finally, we get to these XY plane questions I've been talking about. It's a big part of the test. 23 questions in total, I predict, will involve these XY plane concepts in some way. That's more than half of the entire SAT math section. So what does this include? Well, there are a few ways to break it apart, and I think that'll give you a better sense of what is in the deck for these questions and what's likely to show up in your hand for these questions. So one way we can think about it is by looking at fundamental equations that we just need to understand. So the most fundamental equation on the SAT is y equals mx plus b. So about 6 questions will just, in some pure and simple way, ask about how those kinds of equations behave, how lines behave. Similar to that, we have about 4 questions that'll be about the properties of quadratics, 3 that'll be about exponential equations, and probably on every SAT, you'll get 1 question that is about the circle equation. So you do need to memorize that if you want to get those questions right. So there are fundamental formulas that we need to know. We need to know what those equations tell us about the shape of the graph of these different kinds of equations. And those are things that just need to be memorized. But as you can see, there's plenty of stuff here in white that doesn't fit those traditional formulas. So there are going to be places where going to Desmos, going to the XY plane will help you understand something that isn't as predictable as these 4 types of fundamental questions. But let's look at it a different way. Another way we can break it down is by some sort of like narrow topic that we are likely to see. So at the top here, we have about 4 questions that'll be about how you understand the way function notation works. About 3 questions will be about the number of solutions for lines, systems of lines, linear equations, things that are maybe parallel or perpendicular. That kind of stuff comes up about 3 times per SAT, so it's a pretty important topic. Similar to that, you'll probably get 1 question that's about the number of solutions when you have a quadratic equation. This often involves that concept of the discriminant, which is a pretty advanced math concept. You'll also have roughly 3 systems of equations that you just need to solve, and roughly 2 questions that involve translations, moving a graph up, down, left, or right. So in all of these cases, there is, just like before with the fundamental equations, stuff that you need to memorize. And these overlap with those things in lots of ways. So for example, that number of solutions x squared is going to be a quadratic question because of the x squared. So it's going to overlap. But these particular topics are important to identify because unlike before, where we're just kind of looking at equations and trying to extract information, these topics often involve certain steps that we need to follow, certain processes that we need to go through. And it's important to know that so that when we do get dealt that card and we can recognize it, we're kind of right off and going with the question. We're not debating what to do. We have some sort of plan right away. But again, as you can see with the white here, there's lots of stuff that's not going to fit neatly into these topics. It's a little bit harder to classify where you'll need to be flexible. But there's another way we can look at these 23 XY plane questions. And you can see it's a lot more simple. We can classify these questions by strategy. So you'll see most of the questions by far are going to involve our main math strategy that I talk about in a lot of my videos, plug points into equations, and another big chunk are going to be solvable with Desmos. This is almost everything that you will see on the math. And this includes not just these XY plane questions. This same kind of rough proportion is going to apply to the other topics we did as well. But the XY plane is really where this shines, specifically because what makes something graphable in the XY plane? Well, it's something we could probably put in Desmos, which is a giant XY plane calculator. And it's graphable because it has both an equation that we can graph and specific points on that equation. So these strategies are really, really useful, including some of the more kind of side quest strategies for these things like arithmetizing and guessing and checking that also involve us putting points into equations in more clever ways. And I will be clear, sometimes it's as simple as literally just typing an equation in Desmos and out pops the answer. Sometimes it's as simple as they give you points and they give you an equation, plug the points in, out pops the answer. So there will be questions that are otherwise hard that are made much easier just using these strategies. Other times they'll still be hard, and using these strategies will just be one step in a larger process, or you'll need to be really clever about how you work the strategy in. You will still need to understand the underlying topic and memorize certain formulas and facts in order to solve these questions, even with these strategies. So sometimes you will need to plug points into equations, but the equation will come from your memory, something like y equals mx plus b, for example. Or sometimes you'll have to be really clever and they won't give you the points, and so we can arithmetize and make up our own points to plug in. So again, like I said, the other categories on the SAT for math are going to involve these strategies too, but it's really XY plane where these things shine. And so when people come out of their SAT and they start to complain right away and they're like, oh my God, the SAT math was so much harder than anything I've ever seen before. It was harder than the practice test. There were topics that were completely different from anything I've seen before. Those people are wrong. They're just plain wrong. I've been doing this a long time and I've seen the tests. Like, I know that they're testing the same things. Again, I know what is in the deck, so I know what is coming up. It's very predictable. And especially since we have strategies that work on such a wide variety of questions, even when things are unpredictable, we do have this ability to kind of bring it back to something that we understand in a very simple way. So let's go back a little bit and kind of make some more specific predictions about these XY plane questions based on the different ways of thinking about them. If we are thinking about the overall different types of categories of questions, I do predict that many questions will simply require memorization of the properties of these fundamental equations, lines, quadratics, exponentials, and circles. If you have those formulas memorized and the vocabulary associated with those formulas memorized, you'll do very, very well. If you don't memorize those things, you will basically be completely lost. It will be impossible for you to solve some of these questions because you don't have the underlying information, even if you're really good with Desmos. Another way to think about it, remember, was with these individual topics that have some extra memorization. So my prediction was that many questions here will focus on specific topics with their own specific rules and processes that must be memorized. But what we need to be good at here is understanding which topic we're being dealt, right? We could be looking at a number of solutions question, but we might not be able to recognize it. And so there is that extra skill of being able to identify which of these topics is going to be relevant for each question, but that gets easier if you know that those topics are in the deck. Finally, like I said, these strategies are really, really useful. I predict that a few key strategies will help you solve a wide variety of questions. but you can't avoid it. They still are going to require some background knowledge, but at the very least, they're going to make it easier to deal with the deck. We don't know exactly which cards we are going to get dealt, but we do know that no matter what shows up in our hand, these strategies are probably going to work in some way. So they're a nice thing to kind of fall back on when we're confused, or maybe start out with as a step one strategy when we are looking at a question and aren't quite sure how to handle it. But the best way to get better at recognizing when to use those strategies is to subscribe to my channel. The College Board explanations, as I've been saying, are very traditional and textbook. They only take that one approach that you learned in your math class in school, which isn't wrong, it will work, but they won't help you get ready for those unpredictable aspects of the math where more strategic approaches will be helpful. So my goal through this video and through all my videos is to teach you the knowledge that you're going to need for every single topic in the deck to make sure you know what could come up in the deck, but also to give you the strategies that you will need to be flexible no matter what cards you get dealt, because we don't know exactly what our particular test is going to look like, and I want you to be prepared to succeed no matter what cards you get dealt. So when you take a practice test, make sure you use my videos to learn from your mistakes, because I will always help you predict whether or not that same kind of question is going to come up on another test so you can prevent those mistakes next time. And like I said too, I have much more in-depth lessons on my channel for all these topics: geometry, statistics, XY plane, and it will give you more specific predictions basically about what those questions will look like on the test and the kinds of traps and tricks that the SAT sets. Once again, I am Mike Settele. Best of luck on your SAT whenever you take it. And remember, when it comes to your scores, don't settle for less. Settele for more. Thanks for watching.